All right. Okay. All right. So we're recording. Everybody's on. Today, I thought we would spend some time going over the residential contract and almost all the common addendums and amendments and stuff that kind of go with that to give everybody kind of a brief overview. Kathy, I know you've been doing it for a while, so some of this may be review for
Right.
you, but you might also have some opinions or experiences that would be beneficial to everybody else. So, um, this is 31 pages worth of stuff. So I've compiled a list of everything I could think that would be used in a residential transaction, which is most of what we'll be doing. So let's get started. And as always, if you guys have questions, just say something or you can't really raise your hand, but just say something and I'll stop and answer questions as we go. We don't need to wait till the end to go over 20 different questions. So just let me know. So the first thing that we'll go over is that this is for the 1 to 4 uh, this is the 1 to 4 residential contract, which is a single family home all the way up to a fourplex. So duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes all use this same contract, and those are all considered residential properties by most lenders. You don't need a commercial loan like you do when you go to 5 and units and above. You'll also notice that right at the very top of the transaction, this is not used for condos. So if you have a condo, this is not used for condos. It can be used for townhouses, can be used for 1 to 4, but not condos. It can be used, just townhouses and 1 to 4. And you'll also notice this is the resale contract because we have a separate contract for new builds and new homes or homes that are not built yet but are in the process of being built. So the very first part of this contract is the parties. Pretty simple. You're going to have your seller and you're going to have your buyer, and then they're basically just agreeing to convey the property. One thing that some of you newer folks may see in the future, especially if you're dealing with investors either on the sale side or on the listing side or the purchasing side, is somebody putting the name of somebody or an entity and then or assignees being after that. Now, our contracts in Texas by default are assignable contracts unless they specify otherwise. However, sometimes sometimes investors like to be very clear and upfront that they may assign this contract. And basically, when somebody assigns a contract, they're just selling their interest in the contract to somebody else. So the original person that goes under contract is not the eventual buyer. It's mostly an investment thing. So we'll move down here to the property. The first part of this, the ACE part, is really simple. You'll go into the legal description of a property, and almost every property within a city area has a lot and block, and then it has a subdivision name that goes with it. And you can find that on your county tax records, RPR, Realist, all those different tools that are offered to us through TAR. You can find that stuff. Not very hard to do. Then you'll have the city and the county, and then also known as is just going to be your common address. Now, if you're selling something that has a really, really long name and for some reason you can't get it onto it, you can always attach an exhibit to the very end of the contract, and you would just put, see attached exhibit right here in this area, and then you would do that. So that part's pretty simple. The next next 3 parts, are where people don't really understand all the details of this. So the property that people are selling includes, the house and the land, but it also includes fixtures and improvements that are attached to that property. And more specifically, it includes permanently installed and built-in items. So it gives us an example. So valances, screens, shutters, awnings, wall-to-wall carpeting, mirrors, ceiling fans, attic fans, mailboxes, television antennas, mounts and brackets for television speakers. So yes, if your seller has a flat screen TV mounted on their wall and they're selling their home, the TV doesn't stay, but the bracket is considered a permanently installed and built-in item. So they either need to remove that before you show, or you need to put it in the exclusions box here, because technically at the end of the day, if a buyer comes in to do their final walkthrough and they notice the TV mount is gone, they can make an issue and they will be right. Same thing with speaker mounts. You have heating and air conditioning units, security and fire detection equipment, chandeliers, lighting fixtures, water softeners is a huge one that people miss often. They just don't think about it. It's either in the garage or it's in a hallway somewhere tucked behind a door. But if there's a water softener with the house, that's included in part of the sale. And those get really sticky when the water softener is not owned by the seller, but rather leased, or they have a payment plan where they're paying it off, they're paying it off, little by little. If they go under contract and don't exclude that, they're going to have to pay it off out of the sale and leave it there because it is a part of the sale. Kitchen equipment, garage door openers, cleaning equipment. So cleaning equipment is more like central vacuum systems, where you have you have in the garage, you have a big central vacuum system, and then you have, the hose and whatnot that you can move around the house. That system is the hose and whatnot is what that's talking about, not, cleaning products and dusters and stuff like that. Your shrubbery, your landscaping, outdoor cooking equipment. Now, if you have a grill that rolls around, that's not permanently installed or built in. But, if you have a $5,000 grill, that you built out, on your deck, and it's there, and they want to take it with them, they can't do that. It's permanently installed and built in. Let's see what else here. And all other.
Exclude it though, right, Patrick?
What's that?
They can exclude that from the sale.
They can, and we'll get down to, when we get down to D, we'll go over that. A big thing that sometimes people don't understand is you can have a piece of personal property that is built in and installed, and so it's no longer a piece of personal property. For example, in a higher end home, you have a refrigerator, right? Refrigerators are almost always personal property. If the buyer wants it, they have to do a non-realty addendum, which we'll look over in a second. It's not a part of the sale. However, in a higher end home, a lot of times a refrigerator will be put into a set of cabinets, and then those cabinets will have a nice piece of molding or something, that goes around it. So basically, you can't just slide the fridge in and out. The only way to get it out would be to remove that molding. Usually the doors will match the cabinetry. That would be an example of a personal property item that has now become permanently installed and built in. That would be a part of the sale. Because if your sellers go in and pull off that molding and pull out that really expensive fridge, they've now altered the structure of the house, and so now they've taken a built-in item and they've removed it. So that would be an example of something that's personal property that it has now become part of the house. Same thing if you had a really nice bookshelf and you screwed that bookshelf into the wall because it was so big you were worried about it falling. That bookshelf is now permanently installed because you've screwed it into the wall. So you would have to leave it unless you exclude it, which we'll get to in a second. So those are considered improvements to the property. And then you also have accessories. Okay, and a lot of people miss these too. So the following described accessories also are a part of the property. These include window AC units. I had this on my house when I bought my personal residence. The seller liked her bedroom really, really cold, so she added an window AC unit just cause. And then she took it with her, and I was going to sell it and get some money for it. So I hit up the listing agent and said, "Hey, this was removed," and she ended up having to buy me a new one because they took it. It's a personal piece of property, but it's a part of the house. It includes fireplace screens, curtains and rods, which a lot of people miss, blinds, window shades, drapes and rods, door keys, mailbox keys, above ground pools and swimming pool equipment. Okay, and then and then some other stuff, and then any of the controls for the garage doors, entry gates, and whatnot. So those are also a part of the property. They're not permanently built-in improvements, but they are a part of the property's description. So how do we deal with things that we don't want to, if our sellers are like, "Hey, I don't want to give away this chandelier. It's been in my family for 100 years. We take it with us everywhere we go." How do we get around that? And so what Kathy was talking about just a few minutes ago was the exclusions, which is the D section. So exclusions are basically any improvement or any accessory that the seller does not want to transfer. So if it's that chandelier, if it's our really fancy ceiling fans, if it's our TV mounts, if it is, I don't know, your really nice blinds or curtains that you spend a lot of money on, or your AC units, or window AC units, I should be specific. Those things all need to show up down here in section 2D and exclusions. And if for some reason there's a lot of them and you can't fit them all into here, then go ahead and add an extra piece of paper, type it up, and add it. Make sure it's a part of the contract. This, especially things like window AC units, TV mounts, and stuff like that, those are, for at least in my experience, those are ones that buyers will definitely catch. And a good agent will do a final walkthrough, and if those things are missing, and you're the listing agent, they will call you on it. And if nothing else, they might get a little bit extra money out of your seller for their buyer, and they're totally legit. So, any questions from anybody about this number 2 section?
I'm good.
Okay. All right. So now we go ahead and we move down to the sales price. When you put this in on the form, generally I believe you have to put in the amount of cash and then the amount financed, and it'll automatically generate the sales price instead of doing it backwards. So cash portion of the sale, this is pretty self-explanatory. How much money is your client putting down? This number should always match their pre-approval letter. So if their pre-approval letter says, hey, they're approved for $200,000 purchase price and they're going to put $6,000 or $7,000 down, make sure that these numbers match up. It just makes for a really clean contract. It makes you look professional. It makes you look like you know what's going on. And then you have your financing here. So each one of these bits of financing have a different addendum. I'm not going to go over the loan assumption addendum or the seller financing addendum today. I can at a later date. These are not very common, and if you don't have experience with either one of these, a loan assumption or seller financing, this is something you should come to me with if you end up in a situation where you're going to be doing that. So today we're just going to go over this third-party financing addendum. And then together, those make up the price. Okay? And then we had a change a couple years ago where when you buy or sell a home in Texas and you are licensed, and you own, it's either your property, it's a property of somebody you're close to within, I believe it's one degree of connection, so it's your spouse, your parent, or a child, or if it's a company or a trust or something else where you are at least a 10% owner, you have to disclose that you are a licensee. This is TREC's way of putting out there, hey, this person's licensed, and it kind of helps keep us from taking advantage of people, or at least that's the idea behind it. So it used to be that this was not a part of the contract. They just expected you to do it, and a lot of people, I guess, weren't doing it, or they wanted to make it easier to provide the disclosure instead of putting it in special provision. So now it has its own little section. What I will tell you now, this is not a mandate. You do not have to do this. It is entirely up to you, but it is really good for disclosure, and I'm a big fan of disclose as much as possible. If you are personally connected to the person that you are representing, and when I say personally connected, I don't necessarily mean like, hey, this is my best friend. I mean like any family member or any company that you have any interest in, or anything at all like that, I would disclose that up front. Hey, this is my nephew, this is my granddaughter or my grandson, this is my ex-wife, this is my grandfather. This is a company that I don't have any ownership of, but I receive money from, or something to that effect. I would disclose all those instances, because all it's going to do is help CYA yourself if anything goes sideways. Because if something goes sideways and people want to start making complaints and throwing stuff out there, the more disclosure you have on the table for yourself, the better. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And again, I'm not mandating that you have to. You have to do whatever TREC says, and it's very clear in here which things you have to disclose. I'm just telling you that more disclosure is always better in the long run. And this section is kind of a weird section, because they've never come out and said what's supposed to go here. They just put it there, and is it yes, is it no? So what I usually put in here is just that either seller or buyer, depending on which side of the table I'm on, seller, buyer, is a licensed sales agent or broker in the state of Texas in good standing. And then I put my license number. That's what I always put there. You're making it very clear which side of the transaction you're on, that you're licensed in the state of Texas, and then you're in good standing, and you put your license number. That way, nobody can ever, say you didn't give enough information. Okay.
Wait,
Go ahead.
you don't do that for everyone. You just mean you do that if you're selling your own property, or what are you doing?
If you're selling your own property or buying your own property, if you are representing your spouse, your parents, or a child, or a company or trust that you have 10% ownership or more in, those,
Right.
or if you're the trustee of the trust, those are things that you are required to disclose on.
Right.
This is not every single deal that you do, just those particular items. If I was representing my spouse in a purchase, I would say, buyer is the spouse of a licensed real estate broker in the state of Texas, or
Right.
seller is the child of a licensed real estate broker in the state of Texas, blah, 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 blah. So you're just disclosing your relationship to whoever's a part of the contract.
All right, got it.
Okay. So we're going to move down to earnest money. So if everybody's not familiar with, I'll just review real quick. Earnest money is the money that somebody puts down as a show of good faith to the seller when they are purchasing. That's the money that they're willing to give up should something go sideways or they back out of the contract, in an illegitimate way. That's their skin in the game. So earnest money, at least in the Austin market, and Kathy, you can tell me what it's like where you're at. But the earnest money in the Austin market typically is 1% of the sales price.
Well, sometimes if I'm doing a VA, I usually offer less, like $1,000. And if they take it, fine. If they don't, then I tell my client up front that it may be more than that.
Absolutely. And I agree with that. I've done that too, where I've had clients that are, doing a USDA loan or a VA loan, 100% financing, and they just don't have the cash to put down 1%. So yes, there are those situations where it may not be ideal, or your client may just not be able to do it. As a listing agent, I like to see at least 1% in this box. If you are in a multiple offer situation, maybe you'll put up more. It all kind of depends. Every deal is a little different, but 1% should usually kind of be your goal as a listing agent to get at least that much. And if you're representing a buyer, providing at least 1%, is a pretty good show of faith. Like, hey, we're serious and we want to do the deal. In a multiple offer situation, you could put it, depending on how comfortable your client is and how experienced they are, you may put more. I ended up in multiple offers on my current residence. I went in and put $25,000 in earnest money up because I already knew we were closing. I wasn't worried about it. Just as an example. So the buyer's going to deposit X amount of dollars as earnest money with. Now, depending on who you talk to, the name or the party that goes in this box changes. So in my opinion, this person should be whoever your escrow officer is, not the title company. So some people think it should be the title company. In my opinion, it should be whoever you want the escrow officer to be. That's my opinion. You are free to do either one. Neither one is wrong. I just believe that the intention of this section, after talking to several different people, is for who you want the escrow officer to be. And then the address of where their office is located. Then you have this section here. It says buyer shall deposit additional earnest money of blank within blank of or with escrow agent within blank days after the effective date of this contract. So this may be a section you would use when you have a backup offer, where you're going to put down a little bit of earnest money up front, but then once you get to the time frame where the backup offer is either needs to go into effect or shuts down, you would deposit more. This may also be a situation where maybe your buyer doesn't have the money up front right now, but they will, in a week after they get paid. So maybe you're going to put, kind of like what Kathy was talking about. Maybe the guy or the buyer doesn't have the 1%, for example. So they're going to put down $1,000, and then within 7 days they're going to put down another $1,000. just as an example. This gives you some flexibility on how you would split this up. I do not usually use this second portion. I usually don't have any extra money going, extra earnest money going in after we do the initial contract. So now we'll move down to the title policy. There's a bunch of stuff about the title policy, so we'll go over all this, but it starts with who's going to pay for it. Is the buyer going to pay for it? Is the seller going to pay for it? It's a negotiable item. Typically in our market, in the Austin area market, and then I believe up in the Dallas market, it's a seller's typical closing costs include paying for a title insurance policy. Kathy, would you say that's similar in your area for like a regular deal, not multiple offers or anything like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like that's pretty standard across the state. However, if you get into multiple offer situation where you're trying to make your offer as attractive as possible without having to go up, an incredible amount in price, you can always offer for your buyer to pay the title policy. It could be $1,000 in the seller's pocket, it could be $4,000 depending on the price point of the property. So it's just one more way that you can kind of shuttle money across the transaction back towards the seller if you're in a multiple offer situation. And then we have the name of the title company you're using. So if Betty Sue is the escrow officer and she works for Austin Title goes right here. Okay. And then the title policy is going to be in the amount of the sales price, dated for closing, and insuring the buyer against loss under the following provisions. And so we have just their standard provisions that they don't cover. These are all standard exceptions that they will not cover. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can go back and read through them. When we do buyer's rep agreements, the state of Texas requires us as agents to always, for every single buyer we represent, always requires us to tell them that they need to have their title policy examined by an attorney. Most do not, but we are required by TREC to tell them that they need to get it done. If you're using a buyer's rep agreement, like you should be, that buyer's rep agreement has a statement in there telling them that. And it kind of provides coverage so that they can never come back and say, hey, I didn't know, these different things didn't apply. So make sure that you're using those buyer's rep agreements because they will cover you should they try and say, oh, we didn't know about these exceptions, because you could say, hey, you're supposed to have an attorney review it with you. If you didn't do that, too bad, so sad. Sorry. This number 8 here, okay, this was a revision that came out a couple years ago, I believe, a year and a half ago, a couple years ago, whenever they redid the contract. So it used to be that this was always included in the deals. The buyer almost always paid for it. It was never really a thing that it was just kind of included. Nobody ever really said anything about it. And then I guess it got to a point where people started having issues with it because they were trying to figure out why they were having to pay extra coverage. So what this right here is there is an exception in a standard title policy to shortages in area, meaning if the boundaries of the survey are wrong, they will not defend against those shortages. However, most people will amend that, okay, and it will include shortages in area, so that if their survey is wrong and there's a property line dispute, their title insurance policy will cover that. So if you don't want to do that, you can click this box right here. It says will not be amended or deleted from the policy, or you can go ahead and delete that. Or you can go ahead and add it in that they will cover the shortages in areas. Okay. And then who pays for it, buyer or seller? If I'm representing a buyer, I almost always put buyer, because in the past, this has always been a buyer expense. It's never really been a seller expense. Once they added this little section here at the last revision, all of a sudden it became a contentious point, and, listing agents and buyers agents, everybody would start, fighting over who's going to pay for this extra coverage. And it's a stupid thing to fight over, in my opinion. It's like the cost, I believe, is 5% of the policy amount. So, if it's $1,000 policy, it's $50. I mean, it's not a thing. It's not worth arguing or fighting over. It's not going to be a massive amount of money on either side. Any questions on that?
No.
No? Okay. Now, I will tell you, if you have a buyer, you need to make sure that they get this, that they have shortage and area coverage. It is, there's no reason they should not. I personally have had to use my title insurance policy on a boundary dispute on one of my rental properties. And if I had not had the shortages and area coverage, I would have been on the hook for the $5,000 that it cost us to get that thing taken care of. I had the shortage in area coverage, and so all it was a claim against my title insurance. No big deal. So super important for your buyers to get. There's no reason they shouldn't have it. So then we have the title commitment. So that within 20 days after the title company receives a copy of the contract, the seller shall furnish the buyer a commitment for title insurance. Now, in reality, that's not how it works. It's always the title company that sends it out. It never goes to the seller, and then the seller turns around and provides it. But based on the contract, the seller is the one that's responsible for providing that. So if you're a listing agent and for some reason you're getting to 20 days and you don't have a title insurance commitment, you need to get with your title company and say, hey, we're up against the clock, and it's our responsibility to provide this, and you need to get it done. You're also required to provide legible copies of CC&Rs and anything else that would affect the usage of the property. So deed restrictions, subdivision, restrictions that aren't necessarily CC&Rs, all that kind of stuff. Let's see. So there are several outs on this contract, and so one of them is, where is it? So if the commitment and exception documents are not delivered to the buyer within the specified time, the delivery will automatically be extended up to 15 days or 3 days before closing, whichever is earlier. The buyer may terminate the contract if they don't receive these documents in time. So if these documents are taking a while to get, and you're getting towards the end of a transaction, this is an out that you can use to get out if you have to. What's that? Okay. So move on to section C here. Okay, so we have a survey. Survey must be completed by a registered land surveyor. We have 3 different options when we do surveys. Number 1 is the most used one, and basically it says within a certain amount of days, the seller shall furnish to the buyer and the title company an existing survey of the property and a T47 form. So if you send just the survey but not the T47, you are technically in breach of the contract. So you got to send that survey and that T47. Now, I will tell you, it is common, at least in our area, for the title company to say, hey, just send us the T47 with DocuSign and we'll have them notarize it, at closing. No big deal. If you're comfortable and the transaction's going okay and you feel like that's not going to be a big deal, then I'll leave that up to you to decide whether you're comfortable with that or not. But technically, you're required to provide the survey and an executed T47. And we'll go over the T47 in a little bit. You're required to provide both of those. The T47 is not a TREC form. It is a Texas Department of Insurance form, which is why it has to be notarized, not just DocuSigned or digitally signed. It's got to be notarized, actual wet signatures, because title insurance is insurance and it's regulated by the Texas Department of Insurance. They're allowed to have their own forms for that kind of stuff. In big bold letters, next is that if the seller fails to provide that survey or the affidavit, okay, the buyer can obtain a new survey and the seller will pay for it no later than 3 days before closing. Okay, so this is a big one. If you do not have to, if you're a listing agent, the buyer's agent does not have to tell you, hey, we ordered a new survey because you didn't get us the stuff in time. They can just order it, have the title company order it, not say anything to you, and you may not know about it until a week or 2 before the transaction closes or at the closing table, or not at the closing table, but once you get your preliminary closing disclosure and it shows up on there. But it's in big, bold letters, existing survey or affidavit. If you don't provide both, you can be dinged for it. If they provide the existing survey and the affidavit, but one or both are not acceptable to the title company or the lender, the buyer can obtain a new survey, and then it's kind of a negotiable item about who's going to pay for it. Obviously, if you're on one side of the table, you're trying to get the other side to pay for it. Uh, if you're in a multiple offer situation, this is another portion of the contract where you can say, hey, look, my buyer will pick up the cost of the survey if we need a new one. It's not a big deal. The more experience you have looking at surveys and how old they are and what they look like and what's actually on the property, you can certainly go ahead and say, hey, we'll go ahead and we'll give it to you. No big deal, knowing in the back of your mind that the likelihood of you having to get a new survey is probably small. So, and then we just have this number 2 here. If you can just straight up select this and say, hey, we're getting a new survey and the buyer is going to pay for it. No big deal. And so that one, you can just totally exclude all this negotiating and getting it from the seller. Just say, hey, buyer's going to get their own survey. No big deal. Or you could just say, hey, seller's going to get a new survey. No big deal. So you can certainly opt to just have a new one. There's never anything wrong with a buyer getting a brand new survey in their name. It all just comes down to kind of a money thing. So number 1 is probably the most often used, but 2 and 3 are certainly capable of being used as well. So then we have, yes, ma'am.
But the on the survey too, well, I think it's important that the buyers understand you can use it to close, but if there's a dispute between neighbors later, if you've used an existing survey, it's not been done in your name, you can't use that in lawsuit. So you'd have to have another one then.
So my understanding is, yes, you're correct. But the title company will still be responsible for the cost of that. So you're paying for title insurance. Somebody's paying for title insurance, and part of the title company's job is to say, hey, is this survey that we're going to insure a good survey? And so if they've sent the survey to their underwriter and their underwriter has approved the survey, whether it's in your name or not, and they approve the T47 affidavit, they're required to provide you insurance for if you have the boundary coverage. They're required to provide you insurance and defend against that. You're absolutely correct that the first thing they'll probably do is order a new survey from an independent third party surveyor. But that, as far as the lawsuit goes, they're still on the hook for covering you for that lawsuit. And I will tell you in my own experience that once there was a boundary issue between me and a neighbor, and the neighbor decided they wanted to sue, I took that lawsuit, sent it over to the title insurance company, and the first thing they started to do was try to settle with this other guy. They didn't even want to go ordering a new survey or anything. They kind of reviewed the evidence that they have, and they tried to settle with this guy. When he didn't want to settle, then they ordered a new survey, got the new survey, and said, okay, let's do this if that's what you want to do. And we ended up settling. The title company ended up settling, but they're still bound to provide coverage for you even if you're sued. Does that make sense?
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not what I understood. So that's good and interesting.
Yeah, okay. No, that from my experience, professionally, that's how it is, and then personally, that's how it is. That's why that T47 is so important, and that's why a title company can get a survey and say this survey is no good. It's too old. Things have changed on the too many things have changed on the property. Right. You added a huge building to the back of the property, and we want to make sure it's not crossing the boundary lines. That's why they would say, no, we're not going to use a survey and force somebody to get a new one. Because once they sign off on that survey, they're on the hook for it, for at least defending it and the cost and all that kind of stuff up to your policy amount. So then we'll
typically what I'm sorry. What I tell them is that if it comes down to dispute, you may or may not have to get one, but this will close your thing, and you may never have a dispute. So it's up to you, especially on a block and block house. You're probably not going to. Most of the time, you won't have a dispute.
Absolutely, I completely agree. If you're living in a neighborhood, a master plan community, the likelihood of you ever having an issue with that is slim to none. When you start getting into older sections of your city, established neighborhoods, rural country land, stuff like that, that's where you'll start having issues. Right. Absolutely. Okay. So then we move down to section D here with objections. So, buyer may object in writing to defects, exceptions, or encumbrances to title disclosed on the survey, other than the previously listed items. So these, for this area right here, these are where I usually put things like, like if I want to use it as a rental, I'll put residential leasing. Or if I want to have a motor home, I'll put, RV, however you want to phrase it. RV can be kept on site. Um, you know, you know, buyer wants to, install a pool, or anything, any little extra things that are kind of beyond the norm that are really important to your buyer. This would be the area where you can put that, in case there's a deed restriction that says, hey, no pools, or you can't run any home-based business out of your house. So stuff like that should go right here. These would be specific to things that would relate to like the function of the property. Now, this doesn't really relate to CC&Rs or HOA regulations because we have a separate section for that, but these are really good for like deed restrictions and stuff like that.
Okay.
Okay. And then we have title notices. Now, these are title notices. These are basically just boilerplate disclosures that need to be made. So here we go. Broker advises buyer that an abstract of title covering the property should be examined by an attorney of the buyer selection. So we have it in the buyer's representation agreement. We also have it here again in the contract. The membership in an HOA. So it either is or it is not subject to mandatory membership in a HOA. This is an important one. So if you're in an HOA, you need to make sure you click this or select this is portion here, and then you're going to go on to the HOA addendum, which we'll go over here in a little bit. A nice big bold print says that you're obligated to pay assessments to the property owner association, so they can't ever come back and say, "Oh, I didn't realize I had to pay dues," and that they could enforce that if you don't. And then if buyer is concerned about these matters, the TREC promulgated addendum for property subject to mandatory membership should be used. I don't care if your buyer is concerned about it or not. You got to use this addendum always, 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 always. Mostly because that addendum is going to kind of cover some things like transfer fees, getting you copies of the CC&Rs and stuff like that. So if you're in an HOA, mandatory membership, because there are some that are not mandatory. They're existing, but they're not mandatory. But if it's mandatory, you should always use the addendum for a property in the HOA. Statutory taxing districts. So this kind of talks about different taxing districts that may overlay. So in Texas, we have MUDs, which are municipal utility districts. So like, water and stuff like that. So those overlap. City taxes, county taxes. This is just kind of a disclosure for that. Tidewaters. I actually don't have a lot of experience with this because I don't sell a lot of property right on the beach. Kathy, you ever had any experience with any of this in your area?
No.
Okay, so yeah, unless you're like on the coast selling property that's like within like real close to the coast, you probably won't end up needing to worry about this. Notice about annexation that if you're in the county, just because you're not in the city doesn't mean someday you won't be in. You won't be. This is a good disclosure because somebody calls you and says, hey, I bought my house last year and all of a sudden they're bringing us into the city and my taxes are going through the roof. Why didn't you know about this? Well, go back to your contract and here was a notice that you could have been. Certain utility providers and how those might affect a certain area. Public improvement districts, again, another taxing overlay that they should just be made aware of. Transfer fees, propane gas system areas, and notice of water fluctuations. The notice of water fluctuations is a new one. This is mostly a notice for people that sit like on a lake, so that they know, hey, the water level may change, so that they can't come back later on and sue somebody because all of a sudden the lake ran dry. So now we're down here, property condition. So a couple important things here. So the seller shall permit buyer and buyer's agent access to the property at reasonable times. Okay, this is throughout the contract, not just during the option period, not just the first few days. The whole time you're under contract, you and your buyer have reasonable access to the property, with sufficient notice, and you can't say no. Same thing if you're on the listing side. You need to explain to your sellers that, hey, they can request to come out really at any time. And I'll tell you a great example of this is out here we have Lake Travis out here near Austin. Well, properties that are on Lake Travis, the view of the lake is really important. Well, so is the sunsets. People really like the sunsets. So sometimes buyers will say, "Hey, we would like to come over and watch a sunset from the back deck of the house." And so that they're perfectly entitled to do so. In fact, most of the listing agents out there know that, so they'll, set up wine and cheese and crackers and all that, a little crap, and make it a nice experience for them. Set up some chairs, and the buyers will come out there, drink wine, chips and cheese and whatever else, and watch the sunset. That's a reasonable access to the property that they're entitled to. So just make sure you tell your sellers, hey, it's not just during the option period, it's really any time during the contract, as long as it's reasonable, they can come over and check out the house. This section right here gives us the authority to inspect the house. The inspector has to be licensed by TREC or otherwise permitted to make inspections. So, for example, if you have a buyer who's like, hey, my cousin Joe is a contractor and he's going to come over and do the inspection. No, not acceptable under the contract. It's got to be a TREC licensed inspector or somebody who is otherwise permitted to make inspections. So that's not really anybody. It's not really anybody other than TREC. So their contractor friend is certainly welcome to come over and walk the house with them, but doing inspections the way an inspector does, it's got to be a TREC inspector. A new section we have, and this actually will change here in the next contract revision that's coming up. So any hydrostatic testing must be separately authorized by the seller in writing. Does anybody not know what hydrostatic testing is? And it's okay if you don't. Most people don't.
I've had to deal with it, so I know what it is.
Okay, just in case for those that watch at a later date, if you don't. So hydrostatic testing is basically when you test the pressure of the integrity of the pipes in the home. And so you load up the pressure in the system, make sure that there's no leaks and nothing else breaks. In the new contract, there'll be a separate section for this, but if you're going to do hydrostatic testing, specifically on an older home, well, actually any home, but you will likely only do it on an older home, you have to have the seller's permission. And the reason you have to have the seller's permission is because a hydrostatic test oftentimes may damage pipes. You increase the pressure in older pipes and they're either going to bust or break or generate a leak. And if that happens, if you don't have the seller's permission, your buyers are on the hook for fixing that, whether they close or not. So, you got to make sure it's very clear. Then the other thing that oftentimes becomes an issue is that sellers are required to keep the utilities on from the time you go under contract until the time you close. So that whole period of time. So this changes slightly when you do things like foreclosures and stuff like that, because they will use either their own contracts or they'll provide an addendum that basically gets rid of this whole section right here. But if you, on your typical transaction, your seller needs to leave the utilities on the whole time. And if they don't, they're in violation of the contract. What does that mean? Well, kind of depends on what your buyers want to do. If your buyers want to walk because they can't inspect the utility, if they take their earnest money and they leave, they can do that. You guys can try and leverage them to extend the option period so they can get the utilities on, but the utilities need to be on from the time you go under contract until the time you close. Moving on here, so the property condition, we have the seller's disclosure notice, and we have 3 different sections here. This is another area of the contract where you can provide your client with an out. So you have buyer has received notice. Pretty self-explanatory. They got the notice. And then we have a section here that says buyer has not received the notice, but within X amount of days, the seller is going to provide the notice. The reason that this is an out is because once they get it, once the buyer gets the notice, even if they get it the same day you go under contract, you have 7 days to basically back out of the contract for any reason. Okay, so I've used this before on a multiple offer situation. It was kind of tricky. I selected, hey, we don't have it within 2 days, you'll provide it. We did a no option period for this multiple offer situation. And then we went under contract. We had inspection done. Inspection came back way worse than we thought it did. So we bounced. And the listing agent was like, hey, you don't have an option period. And I said, well, you're right, but but we also notated that we didn't have this disclosure notice, and he's like, but we provided to you the same day. And I said, you're right, you did. And under the contract, it gives us 7 days uh, to terminate for any reason. And so we kind of used that. They weren't very happy about it, but that's kind of one of those knowing the contract so well that you can kind of manipulate people and still be within the confines of the contract. If you are a listing agent and you are not providing the seller's disclosure notice ahead of time, before you let your client, your seller, sign off on a contract, make sure you change this section. Make sure you send them the seller's disclosure and make sure that they change this box to the fact that they have received a notice, because it's going to remove this one freebie exit right here that they have. And then there are certain.
Why do we have an option period then? I've never thought about that away. That's kind of tricky. That's I mean, good if you're the buyer's rep, but I mean,
It is. I mean, you could select number 2 here and put 1 day, and you basically get your 7 day. You get a 7 day option period. Is basically what you get. And so at the bottom, you could say, hey, no option period. And most agents won't catch it. They'll be like, oh, no option period. That's awesome, like that. And they'll tell their seller, like, oh man, they have to, they're definitely have to close because they can't even get out of the contract. But they don't notice this because a lot of people don't read the contract. They don't know what they're doing.
well, I hadn't realized that. Okay, so if you had number 1 and they give you the notice up front, then you can't really play that, right? I mean,
No, you can't. But here's what I will do sometimes. Even if I have the notice, I'll still select number 2 and put like 1 day or 2 days in there, even if they've sent me the notice. Because just because they've sent it to me doesn't necessarily mean that I have it or that I've reviewed it. And so, if they're willing to sign off on number 2, then it is what it is. So, and you're not lying, you're not being shady about it. You select that option on the contract, and you're asking them to send it to you after you get done. So, yes, that's a way to kind of wiggle in a 7 day option period without having to actually have an option period. And then we have down here, we have the seller's not required to furnish a seller's disclosure. And I know I'm going to embarrass myself because I should know all of these, but I don't know all of them off the top of my head. But things like estate sales, foreclosures, REOs, I believe if it's certain kinds of trusts, I believe, aren't required. There's I think it's only 5 or 6 of them. But otherwise, everybody else is required to provide one. Okay. If the house was built before 1968, we have to provide the seller's disclosure of lead-based paint notice, which is actually a notice that I should have included in this presentation, but I didn't. But we'll get to it. It's at a later date. Our contracts generally are as is. So it says right here, as is means the present condition of the property, yada, 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 yada. Buyer agrees to purchase the property as is. Now, that doesn't mean they can't negotiate later on for repairs and stuff like that, but at the time of acceptance, they're accepting as is. So you have 2 boxes. Buyer accepts as is, or buyer accepts as is provided the seller does, X, Y, Z. In this area, a lot of people will put in special provisions things like, seller to have home cleaned, professionally cleaned, upon move out or something like that. Those kinds of things are better put in this section right here. It's a repair or it's a treatment. In that case, having it cleaned is a treatment. It just fits better in this area than putting it in special provisions, in my opinion. So if you're going to have something like that, it's better to put it there. Or say they have, they need to repaint. You want them to repaint the inside of the home because it's just gross. You could certainly have, seller paints interior, provided seller paints the interior of the home. And you can be specific with, the type and color of paint and whatnot. So if the buyer wants them to do something before they'll accept it, you put that here in this area. Lender required repairs. So people forget that sometimes the lender can certainly come in and say, hey, certain things need to be repaired before we will even close on the loan. And that means that the seller is going to have to pay for them. Technically, it doesn't say who has to pay for them. If your buyer wants to pay for seller or for lender required repairs, they're certainly welcome to. I would always advise against anybody, including an agent, putting any money into a home that's not theirs. So just keep that in mind. So we have here, unless otherwise agreed in writing, neither party is obligated to pay for the lender required repairs, which includes, termite treatment. If the parties do not agree to pay for the lender required repairs, the contract will terminate. Earnest money is refunded. If the cost of the lender required repairs and treatments exceeds 5% of the sales contract, the buyer has the option to terminate this contract and earnest money will be refunded. I'll be honest with you, I don't know why we have that section there, because right before it says that if the parties don't agree for somebody to pay for it, it terminates. So if it's 10% and they don't agree, then you're still going to terminate. So I'm not 100% sure why they ended up putting that one in there. Section F is a.
I've had like a young couple trying to buy a house that's an older seller,
Mhm.
and they have lender, like say in a VA, and they have to do some moving this stuff like foliage away from the house or something like that. And then that young couple have gone over and done it just because the older couple didn't have the money, the money to get it done right then.
Right.
And I told them up front, I said, if this falls apart, you're stuck. They said, that's okay. We want the house. So, they just went over and took care of it.
Yeah, no, and clients are certainly welcome to pay for it. You as an agent are certainly welcome to pay for it. The listing agent is certainly welcome to pay for it. You just got to make sure you provide some disclosure up front that says, hey, you're putting money into a house that's not yours. It could possibly not close, and then you're out that money or time or whatever else. And if people are like, hey, I'm cool with that, no big deal, then fine. Your best bet's to try and get it in writing. So send them an email with that same information and just have them respond so that you can put that in your file that you said that, especially if they're going to spend money and not just time. But at the end of the day, if they want to do that, they're certainly welcome to do that.
Right.
So our next section here is the completion of repairs and treatments. So this changed a few years ago in the contract. Repairs that are done have to be done by a licensed individual if there's a license, and if there's not a license, they have to be completed by somebody who is commercially engaged in that trade or practice. So for example, the easy stuff is electrical and plumbing, HVAC, stuff like that. Licenses are required, so that's pretty simple. The things that are not simple are things that you have no license for, but you have trade. So for example, roofing, painting, siding repair, foundation. Those are all things that don't require licenses in Texas, but if you're going to have to do a repair like that, you still have to have somebody who's commercially engaged in that trade. So you have to hire a painter, you have to hire a roofer or a foundation company. You can't do any of those things yourself. The exception to that is unless the buyer agrees in writing to let the seller do the repairs. So if part of your amendment says, hey, buyer authorizes seller to complete repairs, on their own without hiring somebody, you could put that in there, but otherwise it has to be done by a professional. And here's where this gets kind of sucks, is that, say inspection comes back and says, hey, you have a faulty light switch. Okay, light switch costs you what, $1 at Home Depot, and it's not that hard to change out. Well, according to the contract, that light switch needs to be changed out by an electrician. So that's such a small job, an electrician is not going to charge you just to do that. They're going to charge you whatever their minimum fee is. So that could be $150, $120, $200. So all of a sudden your $1 light switch, and maybe an hour of time now becomes a $200 expense that you're going to have to pay for. So this is one of the reasons that I always advise a seller, if they're able to get a pre-inspection. So before we go to market, I recommend, hey, let's have an inspector come over, do a pre-inspection, and that'll give us an idea of kind of what we have, in the home. And then you can fix it before you go under contract. Because once you're under contract, that's when these requirements to have professionals do it. If you get a pre-inspection, the pre-inspection comes back and says, hey, this electrical outlet needs to be changed out, this switch needs to be changed out, there's some shingles that need to be repaired, on the roof, and I don't know what else. The coils on your AC unit need to be cleaned. Okay. If that stuff comes back and your seller is like, hey, I know a handyman that can do that work. So he hires a handyman to do it. Cost him $250, and half a day, and all those things get done, versus paying $1,000 to have several different trades do that stuff while you're under contract. So it's just, if you're doing them outside the contract, then it doesn't have to be a professional. Once you're in contract, it has to be unless the seller agrees otherwise. Questions?
Once I had we had an electrical thing in the house, and the seller was a licensed electrician, but I even had him sign off on that the seller could do the repair because he was a licensed electrician, because I just want to make sure that they didn't, weren't upset by that.
Absolutely, that's a good point. Your seller may be one of those licensed professionals, so if they're going to do their own repairs, you need to have you still should get that disclosure. That's an excellent point. Let me see if there's anything else here. Not that I can think of. Environmental matters. So this is just a notice that the buyer is advised of the presence of wetlands or toxic substances, yada, 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 yada. May not be there. It may be there, but we provide the notice for everybody. Then at the bottom of this page, we have the residential service contract, which is the same as a home warranty. So if your buyer wants to get a home warranty, this is a place where you can negotiate the seller to cover a certain amount. I don't know why it's whatever. It's this space right here. In our area, for a decent home warranty, I usually put $500 in there. Some people put $450, some people put $600, $700. Really what you want to put is an amount that's going to cover a decent warranty. So if you're doing a higher end home, let's say you're doing $1 million home, 6,000 square feet, 3 different AC units, and some other stuff, $500 is not going to buy you a home warranty to cover all that stuff. So your best bet is to find a home warranty company that your buyers want to utilize, and get a custom quote for how much they think it's going to cost to do it, to get coverage, and then put that amount in there. Cookie cutter homes are a little different, but anything high end or that's out of the ordinary, you're probably going to want to get a specific quote so you can put the right amount of money in there. What people don't understand sometimes about this section is this only pertains to home warranties. So if your buyer does not get a home warranty, this is not money they can use in any other area of the transaction. It's not just $500 or whatever the amount is that the seller is giving your buyer. It's them giving it for this very specific purpose. So just keep in mind, if you work this in the contract and your sellers decide, hey, you know what, I don't want a home warranty for some reason, I don't know why they would, but let's just say they did, they don't get that $500 anywhere else in the transaction. It's only for a home warranty. Any questions about this whole section we've just covered, the property condition at all? Anything? Okay. All right. The next section is real short. Just says that the fees for the brokers are just subject to agreements that are outside of the contract. So section 9. So we have our closing date, on or before whatever the date is, or within 7 days after objections made under paragraph 60, which is that one where we put in RVs or residential leasing, stuff like that. So this is our closing date. Okay, and then here are the things that happen at closing. So the seller executes a general warranty deed conveying the title of property. Buyer pays the sales price in good funds. They all sign their paperwork. They take care of any liens or anything else, back taxes, anything else that's on the property. They take care of that stuff. And then if there's a residential lease, the seller transfers the security deposit to the buyer. Let's see here. The one thing I'll say about this is that y'all are familiar, or should be familiar, with the time is of the essence provisions of our contracts. So there are some certain dates on our contracts that very clearly state time is of the essence, meaning that date is a hard date. That time is a hard time. If you go past that, too bad, so sad. It is what it is. The closing date is not one of those areas. So if your buyers are scheduled to close on the 30th of September and the lender's not ready to go by the 30th of September, but they'll be ready to go by the 4th of October, you're still in contract. The seller can't just say, oh, you didn't close on the 30th, we're done, we're moving on to another offer. That is not an acceptable way to handle things. As long as your buyer can still close within a reasonable amount of time proximate to the closing date, you're good to go. So if you're on the listing side, it is important to explain that to your sellers. Hey, this is our target date for closing. It may change a little bit. If it changes a little bit, you're still going to be obligated to close. And then as a buyer's agent, you really need to push to meet that date. And if you're not going to meet that date, you really should get an amendment to amend the closing date to a time when you can certainly close. But if for some reason the seller is being hard-headed and won't execute an amendment changing the closing date, then as long as you can close within a reasonable amount of time after that closing date, you are still in contract. So is there any questions about that at all?
I'm good.
Okay. And if you miss a closing date and you're having troubles with this, the listing agent or the seller, like, too bad, so sad, we're moving on, give me a call and I'll step in and help you take care of that. That's not something you should deal with on your own if you're not comfortable doing so. We move on to possession. So the buyer gets to take possession either upon closing and funding or according to a temporary residential lease form. So either that's the seller's lease back or the buyer's not lease back, but whatever the buyer's lease is before closing. So almost always you're going to have, upon closing and funding, but if your seller's hanging out for a week or two after closing, it's going to be according to this temporary residential lease. And then in big bold letters right here, consult your insurance agent prior to a change of ownership and possession because coverage may change. So, we need to make sure that, if your seller is closing, okay, or if you have a buyer and they're closing on the property and that seller is going to shut down their insurance, we need to make sure that they have some type of insurance to cover their stuff, because you don't want your buyers to be responsible for their stuff if the house for some reason burned down. Likewise, if you're the listing agent, I would advise my sellers, keep your homeowner's insurance going until you move out of the property. It's going to cover extra coverage for the property itself, and it covers all your stuff. And then we have a section here. It says leases. So after the effective date, seller may not execute any lease. So if you go under contract on the 1st of October, the seller can't all of a sudden lease a room or lease the house out to somebody, October 5th. So once you execute, seller can't do any leases or anything else like that. If the seller already has a lease on the property at the time of execution, so an investment property, for example, they need to deliver the buyer a copy of those leases within 7 days. And if they don't do it, then this isn't an out so much, but if they don't do it, they are in a violation of the contract. And so now we're moving on to special provisions. So special provisions is like the bane of Trek's existence. And it is the source of a lot of lawsuits and a bunch of other negative stuff. So things that in special provisions are factual things about the deal, very specific things. You are not writing in stipulations here, if the home doesn't appraise, buyer will cover the difference in cash or something like that. We're not doing that in these special provisions. We're not writing legal language in this section. We're just factual things. Seller will be out 3 days before closing. That would be an example of something you could put in there. Let's see. Let me give another example. We already talked about how cleaning should go up in the other section, but we could put buyer may use a different lender during may switch lenders during the transaction. That's something. It's just factual. It's not. We're not stipulating anything. Those are kind of things that should go in here. You also have this little section here that says Trek prohibits a license holder from adding anything in here that we have an addendum for. So if we have a form for whatever you're putting in special provisions, you have to use the form. So, seller needs to sell their current home before they purchase this one. That can't go in there because we have a form for that. We have an addendum for sale of other property that needs to be used. So if there's a form for it, it doesn't go in here. That's why this space, for those of you who are newer, this space used to be twice the size of what it is. This blank space right here, it used to be twice the size. And so they've made it smaller and smaller with every contract revision, trying to deter people from using it. So we're getting towards it. Yes, ma'am.
I have a thing I put in there and it says buyer respectfully request a response to this offer contract within 24 hours of receipt of the seller's agent.
So here's the thing with that. Okay, that you're entering that into the contract, but you don't have an executed contract. So you're putting a stipulation into a contract that's not binding. So what I usually do is I won't put anything like that in the contract, but when I send the contract over to the listing agent, I will put in the email to the listing agent, hey, our client is requesting a response within 24 hours. You know, if you don't respond within 24 hours, we will withdraw our offer and move on. And then what I do is I set up an auto email to automatically go out 24 hours from that time, rescinding our offer. So,
Mhm.
so essentially, I mean, you're basically saying respond or we're gonna walk, right?
Mhm.
And the idea is to push them to make a decision so they don't play your offer against somebody else, so they don't dilly dally and stuff like that. Um, Using that on every deal might provide some friction that you may not necessarily need, but there are definitely times when it's worth doing. I'll just do it in an email. I'll set up an automatic email to go out. So if I'm out with my family or I'm doing something, I'm not near my computer or near my phone for some reason, the email will still go out. And so if they don't respond within 24 hours, boom, email gets sent. We rescind the offer. No harm, no foul. We're good to go. Um, just because you rescind the offer doesn't mean the listing agent can't call you back and say, "Oh my goodness, we didn't know you were serious. We still want to make a deal." They can certainly just because you rescinded doesn't mean you can't still be under negotiations, but that covers you by rescinding it with a written notice. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Yeah.
So, because if
But
you
is it bad to put it? I mean, basically, I've just found since I started doing that, it's not really, I mean, it just kind of helps them realize that you're serious and everything else, and it's right there in the contract. And that way, the seller actually, that it is communicated by the agent, because they're going to see the contract.
so I don't know if there's anything wrong with putting it in there, but it's not an enforceable provision.
Right.
So,
Right. No. No.
what I mean by that is if you put that in there and then they execute it at 27 hours and you didn't rescind it in writing anyway, it's still a valid contract.
Right. So
So,
no harm, no foul thing, but it kind of makes them realize that we're not going to wait all week long for them to make
absolutely.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. As long as you understand that what I would do is I would tell your client, tell your buyer, hey, look, this is not an enforceable clause that we're going to put in here. So, they could certainly execute it anytime they want. We still have to rescind it in writing, but let's
Hmm.
put this in here so that they see it right in the contract that we want them to respond. So
Right.
as long as your clients understand that, and preferably you get them to sign off in writing on that,
Hmm.
there's no harm and no foul. But if
Right.
you don't get that from them and they sign this, and then at
Hmm.
28 hours it's executed, and your buyers come back and go, what the hell? We put in there that it's not after 24 hours it's no good, and they signed it, and you're saying now we're under contract and we have to, but it was 28 hours and you said 24. That's where you get into issues because all of a sudden they were thinking one thing and the enforceability is not really there, and so you kind of get into a tight spot.
Well, what I said was a request a response. It doesn't mean that you execute. Like you could have a counter within 24 hours,
Right.
or something.
Right.
You know.
Say they don't counter for say 24 hours rolls around, they don't counter, they don't send you anything.
Hmm.
Then, but all of a sudden in your email, all of a sudden the listing agent calls you at 28 hours and says, "Hey, we're executed." And you're like, "Well, we've already started looking at other houses, or we already put an offer in on our backup house." You know, that it,
Yeah, I would rescind before yeah, before we put another offer in, I would rescind the whole thing.
yeah. Not only that, but that the language that people often use is kind of vague, and
Hmm.
so we request a response within 24 hours. Well, as soon as the agent says, "Hey, I got your offer. I'm gonna present it to my sellers," they've responded to you. They've acknowledged
Yeah.
the offer. So, and
Yes.
the listing agent is an agent of the seller, and so it's just as good as if the seller said something. So, you kind of
Right.
get into a sticky situation, where if you were like, hey, we said 24 hours, and the listing agent goes, yeah, I responded, I acknowledge the offer. What's the problem? Then you're also,
Right.
it's another. That's why it's kind of a sticky clause to put in there because there's not a lot of enforceability and there's a lot of gray area. But
Okay.
whatever you think is gonna be best, just make sure you CYA yourself.
Got it.
So we move on to the settlement and other expenses. So this uh, biggest part of this section for us to worry about is this blank right here. This is where we're going to ask sellers to provide our buyer with some closing costs. So whatever the amount is, it's going to go right here. Okay. Now, one thing that people sometimes don't understand is that, say you put like $10,000 in this box, but the closing costs of the buyer are only 8,000. That $2,000 doesn't get to go towards something else. It's only towards expenses of closing. So, your loan generation fees, survey fees, title fees, prepaids, all those kind of things. It does not mean that, hey, we have an extra $2,000, we're just going to put it towards the sales price. It doesn't work that way. Um,
Right.
so those are just expenses to generate the loan only. And then we have here and then it's very clear here that the expenses payable by buyer include all these different things down here. So it's very clear about what those things are. Okay, and if you read through this big list, purchase price is not a part of that. And then if any expense exceeds an amount expressly stated in the contract, blah 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 blah, then the buyer is still going to be responsible for their own stuff. So we have prorations here. So this paragraph right here explains that every person in the contract is responsible for their portion of the property taxes. So seller's going to cover the taxes all the way through, till the time they sell, and then buyer is going to be responsible for the ones from the time they purchase it till the end of the year. For those who haven't done a lot of deals or haven't seen this, generally, if the sale is in the first part of the year, like the first 6 to 8 months of the year, they're going to prorate the taxes. They're going to collect those from the buyer, or from the seller, and then the buyer is just going to be responsible for paying all the taxes, when they roll out, at the end of the year. If the sale is towards the end of the year, like October, November, December, depending on when your taxing district gets taxes notices out, they may just collect taxes from everybody and just pay them as part of closing. So if you close like November 28th, that's Thanksgiving, November 15th, they may collect 45 days worth of property taxes from the buyer. They may collect the rest from the seller, and they'll just pay your taxes right out at closing, so that nobody's responsible for it because they already know what the amount is going to be. Blah, 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 blah. Casualty loss. So this is if the property is under contract and it's damaged by weather-related things or fire or some other disaster that occurs, then the seller is required to restore the property to its previous condition as soon as reasonably possible, but at least by the closing date. And if they can't, the contract either extends up to 15 days if the buyer wants to, or the buyer can terminate, one or the other. And then after that 15 days, if they can't get it up to speed, then the contract terminates. However, you always can, do an amendment to extend that closing if you need to. The other option here, option C, is that the buyer accepts the property as is in its damaged condition, and the seller agrees to assign any proceeds from the insurance company to the buyer. This does not happen ever when you have a loan on your property, because a lender is not going to close on a property that's damaged and hasn't been fixed yet, or we're still waiting in limbo to figure out where the funds from the insurance company are going to come. It's just not going to happen. So if you have a cash buyer, this would come into play if the house, caught on fire or was damaged or something like that. Otherwise, I just can't think of any lender I've ever dealt with that would be like, oh yeah, house burned down, we're going to lend on it, and we're just going to take the money from the insurance company and rebuild it. That's just not going to happen. Default. So this kind of explains what happens if somebody's in default. So if the buyer's in default, the seller can either enforce specific performance, so they can sue them, to force them to buy the house, or wait, lost my place. Or they can terminate the contract and take the earnest money as liquidated damages. They can't do both. The seller can't say, "Hey, I'm taking your earnest money and I'm going to sue you to buy the house." It doesn't work that way. Cannot do that. It's one or the other. Usually, they just take the earnest money and move on. But they are certainly welcome to say, "We don't want the earnest money. We want to sue the buyer and force them to buy the house." That doesn't happen very often. On the flip side, if the seller is in default, then the buyer can either sue them and make them sell it, or they can terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. Not a bad gig for the seller because they get the earnest money. Kind of stinks for the buyer because they're out money for inspections and some other stuff. So if you have a seller that's like 3 weeks before or like a week before closing is like, you know what, I don't want to sell my house. Too bad, so sad. They can have their earnest money back. No big deal. That would be a conversation that you need to have with your clients and explain to them, hey, you get the earnest money back. You're going to be out the money for inspections. You certainly have the right to sue, if you want to recoup, the money you spent on inspections or whatever else. If we can try and leverage a listing agent to get their seller to pay back the money for inspections and whatnot, especially if it's not a legit reason, that's always good. But as always, be careful about offering legal advice. We are not attorneys. We can't offer legal advice. So as far as saying, hey, you can sue for specific performance, stop. You can sue for specific performance. You need to talk to an attorney. That's the end of that conversation. Don't go into, well, you can sue them and then this and that and the other thing. That's not our area. Just say, hey, you can sue for specific performance. If you needed a recommendation for an attorney, let me know and I'll get you a list of attorneys you can use. Any questions about the default or the casualty loss or proration sections?
Nope.
Anybody? Okay. So we come down here. So Texas, as with most things, prefers mediation over suing each other. So the parties agree that if there's a dispute, that they will go to mediation first, and then if they can't resolve it through mediation, then they can kind of go the lawsuit route if that's what they want to do. But mediation is kind of what's pushed. Then we have here that a buyer, seller, listing agent, or listing broker, other broker, or whoever prevails in a lawsuit is entitled to recover attorney's expenses. Then we have some notices about escrow here. So the escrow agent is not a party to the contract. They don't have any liability for performance or non-performance. There's no liability for interest that's earned on the earnest money while they have it. And if they refuse to release earnest money because they're not sure who to give it to, they'll just hold on to it and they're not responsible for that kind of stuff. And then expenses at closing, the earnest money is going to be applied to any cash down payment, then the buyer's expenses, and any excess will be refunded. This happens sometimes in VA deals where the veteran will put down $2,000 in earnest money, and you're able to get closing costs and some other stuff. And so at the end of the day, they get a check back at closing. So they show up, they get their $2,000 back, they'll get a check because they didn't need it. We also have this here where I just talked about, as far as the release of earnest money. So if no closing occurs, escrow agent may require a written release of liability of the escrow agent from all parties, require payment of unpaid expenses incurred on behalf of the party, and only deduct from the earnest money the amount of unpaid expenses incurred on behalf of the party receiving the earnest money. I've never seen a title company withhold money out of the earnest money for expenses. If the deal doesn't close, it's just kind of part of doing business, but it's certainly in there if anybody asks a question about it. And then we have the demand section. So this is important if you have one party who breaches the contract and is refusing to sign a release of earnest money or a termination. So we're going to go through this one line by line, or we're going to read through it and talk about it. So Upon termination of this contract, either party or the escrow agent may send a release of earnest money to each party, and the party shall execute counterparts of the release and deliver the same to the escrow agent. So that part right there says if it's terminated, the parties agree that they will sign the termination. Okay, so refusing to sign the termination or to proceed with it is already in breach of what we have here. If either party fails to execute the release, either party may make a written demand to the escrow agent for the earnest money. If only one party makes written demand for the earnest money, escrow agent shall promptly provide a copy of the demand to the other party. If escrow agent does not receive written objection to the demand from the other party within 15 days, escrow agent may disperse the earnest money to the party making demand, reduced by the amount of unpaid expenses, yada 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 yada, for their stuff. So basically, if you're terminating and you're saying, hey, we're sending a release of earnest money, and we send it over to the other party, and the other party says, nope, we don't agree, we're not going to sign this, the very next thing you should do is send an email to the title company saying, hey, my client is making written demand for the earnest money. Please, please pay attention and process this. Because as soon as you do that, the clock starts, a 15-day clock starts. They need to go ahead and get a copy over to the other party. And if nothing is said, then your clients are going to get their stuff. If there's an objection, then we kind of end up in this limbo spot. The last part of this says that if escrow agent complies with the provision of this paragraph, each party hereby releases escrow agent from all adverse claims related to the dispersal of earnest money. So usually this doesn't come into play because somebody's going to object. But if they don't, the title company will release the money. But usually they want everybody to sign off on it. So if you get into a situation like this, give me a call. Let's handle that together, and we'll go from there. Damages. So any party who wrongfully fails or refuses to sign a release acceptable to the escrow agent within 7 days of receipt of the request will be liable to the other party for the earnest money and any attorney's fees, to go after that party. So this kind of covers the idea that they're just, if there's a dispute, they're just not going to release the earnest money to anybody. They're just going to hold on to it until somebody clearly says it's ours, and the other party says yes, it's theirs. So if you need to sue somebody, this part right here says that you can collect those fees. Representations. So everybody's on the up and up with their stuff. So any representation of the seller in this contract is untrue on the closing date, the seller will be in default. And likewise, you don't want your buyer to be lying about their stuff either. But this specifically just applies to the seller. So we need to make sure that our sellers are on the up and up best we can. Federal tax requirements. So if you're working with a foreign person, which there's a definition that goes with that's not in the contract, you basically agree to allow the title company to either withhold funds or report that stuff to the IRS, so that they can decide how much money that person is going to owe. All notices from one party to the other must be in writing and are effective when mailed, hand delivered, or transmitted by fax or electronic transmission. So a lot of people put their own information here, like the agent. If you're the buyer's rep, the buyer's rep will put their information here. If you're the listing agent, a lot of agents will put their own information here. Don't do that. That is not what these sections are for, and it creates a lot of liability for you as the agent and us as the brokerage in doing that. A lot of people will say, well, I don't want the other side to have my client's contact information. I will tell you my opinion on this as the broker is that we are not the gatekeepers of information. We are not a party to this contract. If the buyer and the seller want to talk to each other, they will figure out a way. And withholding their contact information from the contract to try and prevent that is just a bad thing to do. So I will normally not put phone numbers. I will normally just put my seller's name, or my client's name and an email address for them. I don't put a phone number. I don't put their mailing address. I'll just put an email address for them and their name. That's it. That way, they can communicate if they want to, which they're certainly entitled to do. Now, if the other agent contacted our client, that's a totally separate issue. But if the other party, the other principal to the contract wants to reach out to the other principal, they should be able to do that if they want to. It's not advisable. We should advise our clients like, hey, don't talk directly to the other side. Make sure you go through me. But we should not be trying to keep them from doing that. Does that make sense to everybody that's on?
Yes.
Okay, if somebody's listening to this in the future and it doesn't make sense to you, give me a call. Let's have a conversation about it. I'll explain to you a little bit more in detail why this is not a good thing. But if, for example, you are listed as contact here and they send you a notice and you don't notify your client, say you're on vacation or say you're indisposed for some reason, then and you don't pass that along, it's your ass. You're the one who failed to convey information as the agent to the principal, and that's just not what we don't want, that liability, and you don't want that liability.
Mm-hmm.
Here we have all the other addendums that kind of go over this contract here. So we have third-party financing addendum, the seller financing addendum, the HOA addendum, buyer's temporary residential lease, blah 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 blah, all these different addendums. And then a list, in case it's not listed here, we can fill this in. Pretty self-explanatory here. If you have an addendum or an extra something that goes to the contract, you need to list it here. Okay. And so then we have our option area here. So in Texas, we have an option period, which is an unrestricted right. You can terminate for any reason you want. You don't like the house, you don't like the colors, you don't like the neighbors, you don't like the sellers, whatever. You can terminate. You pay a nominal fee for that. So nominal is a kind of a relative term. $100, $500. It's all relative to the deal and the price point that you're at. That money that your clients are paying, they will never get that back, and they need to understand that. You need to make them clear on that. Hey, this option fee you're going to pay, this is not like the earnest money. You will never get this back. You are purchasing a right to terminate for a specified number of days. So just be very clear with your clients on that. Make sure they understand the difference, especially new home buyers who have never bought a home before. They need to understand the difference there. It must be delivered within 3 days after the effective date of this notice. Okay, and you're going to determine the number of days here. So 7, 10, 15, whatever, depending on the deal. A nice thing they changed last year, the year before that, was that the option period now ends at 5 p.m. wherever the property is located. Okay, so if you have a client from out of state, you need to remind them when you're like, hey, option period expires today at 5 o'clock. That's 2 o'clock your time, or that's 6 o'clock your time. You just need to help them understand if they're not in the same area as where the property is, that those times may be a little different. If no dollar amount is specified there, or the buyer fails to pay the option fee to the seller, then this whole paragraph does not become a part of the contract. Here we have the option fee will or will not be credited towards the sales price. I don't know why it wouldn't be. So I always click will. Okay. And then we have here nice bold letters. We talked about this earlier. Time is of the essence for this paragraph, and strict compliance with the time performance is required. Okay. So you must turn the option fee in within 3 days, and you must terminate via the option period by 5 p.m. on the day it expires. Okay. As a clarification for people who are not sure or who deal with other people who are not sure, the option period starts the day after you go under contract. So if you go under contract on a Monday, that's day 0. Tuesday is day 1. Okay, so if you have an option fee, or I'm sorry, if you have an option period that's 3 days long, okay, and you go under contract on Monday, then it expires on Thursday at 5 p.m. Because Monday is day 0, then Tuesday is day 1, Wednesday is day 2, Thursday is day 3. Okay, it is the day you execute is not day 1, and people mess that up all the time. Brokers mess that up all the time. So I think we had a question in the group about this the other day. So just be aware, option period, the day you execute is day 0, and then day 1 is the very next day. Are we good?
Yes.
Okay. If your clients have an attorney, list their information here. If they don't have one, then don't worry about listing any information. If they don't have one, you don't have to tell them to go get one. We have the executed date. Okay. The execution date is always filled in by the last party that signs the contract. So if you, no matter who you represent, if your clients are the last ones to sign the contract, you need to put a date in there. I can't tell you the number of times I've executed a contract. The other side was the last one to execute. I finally get a copy back and there's no date there. Make sure you put a date in there. Okay. And if you're using like DocuSign and you just want to put like the date right here, it doesn't have to be all like in these nice little things. As long as you have a date in here somewhere, you're fine. Okay. So let me be very clear. Page 1 through 8 of this contract, that is the 1 to 4 contract. Okay. Page 9 is not a part of the contract. It is an information page. Okay. I tell you this because of this section right here where it says listing broker has agreed to pay other broker blank blank of the total sales price when the listing broker's fee is received. Okay, and that the escrow agent is authorized and directed to pay other broker from the listing broker's fee at closing. This page is not a part of the contract. If you put 3% in there, but the MLS says 2%, 2% is what you're going to get. People often are confused about this information page. This page has, let me slide down here, has no initials at the bottom. It comes after the signatures. Okay, it is not a part of the contract. It is simply an information and receipt page. Okay, so I don't care if you put 30% in here of a transaction. The listing agent is only going to pay you whatever is in the MLS. And if you're the listing agent and you're offering 2% and the buyer's agent puts 3% in here, don't make a big deal about it. Don't cause that to be an issue because it's not a part of the contract. Okay?
Wait, back up. I'm sorry. So if it's on the MLS, it's only 2%, but then you in the negotiation you say, well, you want 3%, and they agree to it somehow or another. That you still have to go back to the MLS.
No, so two things there. First of all, negotiations regarding commissions should not be a part of the contract negotiation. That's a violation of TREC and the Code of Ethics. So if you're going to negotiate a different commission, that needs to be done before you submit a contract to the other side. If you're going to go ahead and try to negotiate a different commission than what's in the MLS, you need to use a broker-to-broker commission agreement, which is a TAR form that we have in Zip Forms.
Okay.
And in fact, I can probably pull that up here. Give me 1 second. Of course, it logged me out here. Go to my Zip Forms. Yeah, if you're going to negotiate a different commission, either lower or higher, it needs to go on a broker-to-broker commission agreement form, because that let's see, that's for leases. Yeah, this one right here. So this is a registration agreement between brokers. So this form right here, let me see. I don't know if I can make this any bigger. Can you guys see this form pretty clear?
Yes.
Okay. So we have the parties being the listing broker and the cooperating broker. We have the property. Okay. We are registering our client as the prospect. Okay. And then here we have the cooperating broker fee. Okay. So if prospect enters into a binding agreement, blah, 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 on or before XYZ date, they'll pay, and then you could put like 3% in here. If it was, if the MLS is offering 2 and you wanted 3, you'd put 3 here. There's also a section for leasing. You don't necessarily have to fill that out. Renewals.
Or if you negotiate down to get the deal done, you have to do that with also if you're going to 2%.
Here's what I would say. If you're on the buyer side, it doesn't really matter. If you are on the listing side and the listing agent, the buyer's agent says, "Hey, I'll take 2% from you, to get the deal done. I'm okay with that." Then yes, you need to do this. You need to do this form right here because here's the crappy side of that. Deal closes, closing disclosure shows up, and it only has 2%. And they go, no. MLS says 3%. And you come back and go, yeah, but you said you'd take 2. And they go, no, I want the 3 that's in the MLS. You're required to pay me what's in the MLS. I want the 3. And at that point, all the parties have, the principals of the contract have already signed their stuff. They're bound to do whatever's in the agreement. And
Right.
now they're coming after you, and they want their 3% that's in the MLS. So if you're the listing agent and you're going to reduce the commission paid to the buyer side, you need to do this form.
Okay.
If you're the buyer's agent, you're saying like, hey, I'll take 2%, no big deal, and they're like, okay, sounds good. You're not going to be shady about it, so that's not a
Right.
big deal. But if you're the one that's on the hook for having to pay the other agent, you're going to want to use this form.
Okay.
Okay. Please, for the love of all that is holy, when you submit an offer, take the time to look up the other agent's information and put it in these boxes. I personally despise getting an offer where the buyer's agent fills out their info and fills out nothing on this side. It's like a huge pet peeve of mine. To me, it communicates laziness. So
Right.
if you're working with like an agent that does a lot of production, that's super squared away, that knows what's up, and you fill out this whole section right here, they will be impressed. It will give you some weight when you go in to do your stuff. They're gonna think, you know what, so and so is squared away. Patrick is squared away, filled out the whole contract, looks good, right? So it's super lazy not to do it. It literally takes 5 to 10 extra minutes to do it, and it just makes the whole offer look a lot cleaner. Okay.
I've won multiple offers just because my contracts were all neat and the other agents were a mess.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I will tell you, when I do a deal, if I have somebody that's got a squared away contract, it looks nice, it looks neat, they filled in all the boxes, nothing looks like they missed anything, and it looks squared away, I put a lot more weight in that than I do somebody who sends me
Right.
an offer that's like, half done, or looks lazy in comparison. So, okay, and then we have, our option receipt. So when we receive the option fee as the listing agent, we're going to put the amount of money in here. We're going to sign this, and you're going to send it off. If you are the buyer's agent, you want to get this receipt signed so that you can show, hey, my buyers paid their option fee, and the title company is going to go ahead and pay their contract and earnest money. I'm sorry. Let me back up. The title company is going to receipt out the contract and earnest money once they get it. So there's a box here that they receive the contract and they receive the earnest money. Who from? All nice little info right there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we are at 1 hour and 40 minutes. That's how long it took us to go through just the 1 to 4. I'm gonna not cover the addendums for today. I'm gonna leave that, and maybe we'll do that sometime later this week. So that I don't want to have like a 2.5 hour presentation. It's gonna be a lot. So at this point, I'm gonna stop. If anybody, Kathy, Joe, Robin, or Mike, Ronnie, I see you're there. If anybody has questions, please speak freely, ask questions as long as they pertain just to the 1 to 4 and not necessarily the amendments and the addendums.
I think I asked mine as we went, so.
Okay, good.
I think we're good, Patrick.
Okay. Joe, you got anything? Joe, were you good, brother? I see you popped your mic on. All right, and I don't think Ronnie's had a mic this whole time, so I'm not sure if she has any questions. But anyway, so this has kind of been a coverage of the 1 to 4 resale contract. It's the one you'll use the most. A lot of different moving parts to it. Take the time, especially if you're newer or haven't done a lot of deals, take the time to read through all these contracts, all the addendums, go through them line by line, highlight things, understand how they work. You will be amazed at the amount of agents who have no idea what's contained within our contracts. No idea what's required. They know the big stuff. They know the closing date. They know the option and the earnest money, but they don't know anything else. They don't know all the little details here in the definition of property. They don't know about, the different notices and what they're supposed to do. They don't know about the default provisions and what's supposed to happen. So the more you know about the contract you're using, number one, the better you're going to be at servicing your clients. Okay. The better you're going to be at reducing your liability. Okay. And number three is the more kick-ass you're going to be because you know how to do things that other agents don't know how to do. And you're totally legit, totally legal and ethical. And you're just using the contract to your advantage. I have done a number of deals where the other side gets all bent out of shape and all upset because, you know, I ran circles around them doing stuff that's right in the contract. It's nothing that they've never seen. They should know what's in there, and they don't. And then they get upset about it, and then it's a learning opportunity for them. So, any questions at all? Anybody about anything?
I'm good.
Okay. As always, I appreciate you guys being here and doing some training. I know it's a Sunday morning and we got family stuff going on, so thanks for being here. I'm going to post the video. If you guys have questions later on, comment underneath the video so that we can everybody can kind of see them. And if you guys ever need any help, just give me a call. All right.
Perfect.
Thanks, Patrick.
All right, guys.
Thank you.
Have a great have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
You too.
All right. Bye.